Snow fell with the hushed reverence of a secret, each flake a tiny promise of peace that the city streets below promptly devoured into gray slush. Inside the penthouse apartment, however, no amount of pristine white falling outside could thaw the glacial chill that had settled within. What was once a sanctuary of warmth and shared laughter had devolved into a meticulously curated stage set for the most humiliating act of her life. Catherine sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed, her fingers, despite the expensive hand lotion she religiously applied, trembling as they clutched the divorce papers. These weren't mere documents. They were a formal rendering of a soul cleaved in two. She'd known for months, perhaps years, that the vibrant tapestry of their marriage had begun to unravel thread by thread. Each late night, each distant glance, each carefully worded excuse a silent testament to the growing chasm between her and Victor. Yet, facing the stark reality, the cold, legal finality, was like a physical blow. "Just sign them, Catherine. Let's just be done with this." Victor's voice was clipped, impatient, devoid of the warmth that had once enveloped her like a comforting blanket. He spoke as if he were discussing a quarterly report, a routine business transaction, not the dismantling of a life they had painstakingly constructed together, brick by emotional brick. She raised her eyes, heavy with unshed tears, and for a fleeting moment, a desperate plea flickered within her. She yearned to see in the face of the man who had been her world, her confidant, her lover, some flicker of doubt, a tremor of hesitation, a whisper of regret. But there was nothing, only a vast, emotionless expanse of indifference stretched between them, a desolate landscape mirroring the emptiness that had begun to bloom in her own chest. "After everything we've built, together, this is how it ends?" Her voice, barely above a whisper, cracked under the weight of a pain that Victor, it seemed, was utterly oblivious to. He sighed, a sound heavy with exasperation, as if dealing with a petulant child rather than a woman whose heart was being meticulously broken before his eyes. "Don't make this into a tragedy, Catherine. Everything changes. You'll cope?" "Cope?" The word hung in the air, a hollow echo of comfort devoid of any genuine empathy. Cope. As if years of shared dreams, intertwined lives, and whispered promises could be neatly packaged and labeled as past experiences to be simply coped with. A bitter laugh tried to escape her lips, but it died in her throat, choked by the rising tide of betrayal. The late nights, the faint unfamiliar perfume clinging to his bespoke suits, the increasing emotional distance, she had tried to rationalize them, to dismiss them as temporary blips in their otherwise perfect universe. She had desperately clung to the hope that they were merely navigating a rough patch, a temporary detour on their life's journey together. But now, the chilling certainty settled upon her. It was because of her. Her name remained unspoken, hanging in the air like a phantom limb. But they both knew precisely to whom Victor referred. "Yes, Elena," he confirmed, the name rolling off his tongue with an unsettling ease. "Elena and we're together now." The words struck her chest like shards of ice, each syllable a deliberate act of cruelty. Elena, the woman who had orbited their lives for what felt like an eternity, a spectral presence, a shadow Catherine had deliberately chosen to ignore, now solidified, materialized, and irrevocably installed in her place. What will happen to me?" Her voice was thin, barely audible, devoid of life. Victor shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference that spoke volumes. "You'll keep the penthouse. It's small, but it's more than enough for you." Humiliation, sharp and searing, pierced her deeper than any physical blade could. Years devoted to him, unwavering support during his tumultuous climb to success, sacrifices she had made willingly, gladly, to nurture his ambitions and dreams. and in the end, he deemed her worthy only of this small apartment, a gilded cage meant to confine her broken spirit. Victor extended a pen towards her, his impatience palpable, eager to finalize this excruciatingly awkward chapter of his life and move on to the next, brighter, shinier version with Elena. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear escaping and tracing a lonely path down her cheek. Her heart felt as though it was being physically torn apart. Yet, amidst the crushing despair, a flicker of something new ignited within her, something Victor, in his arrogance and self-absorption, could never have foreseen. With trembling resolve, she took the pen and signed her name. Victor beamed, a predatory flash of satisfaction, snatched the documents in his pre-packed designer luggage, and walked out without so much as a backward glance. Catherine was left alone in the echoing silence of the penthouse, a silence that amplified the hollowness within her. The first tear fell, a solitary sentinel of sorrow, but with it a silent promise was born. Victor, in his blinding haste to discard her, had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events he would one day bitterly, agonizingly regret. The apartment, far from being a prize, was a cage, and Catherine, trapped within its cold, impersonal walls, was about to become something entirely new. The penthouse, far from being the luxurious haven Victor imagined, was a monument to sterile indifference. Its walls, painted in shades of beige that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, exuded a bland impersonality that amplified Catherine's desolation. The air hung heavy with the ghosts of laughter and shared intimacy, now twisted into mocking echoes of a life irrevocably fractured. The scent of dampness clung to the corners of the rooms, mingling with the oppressive atmosphere of confined space, a space utterly incapable of containing the sprawling landscape of her past, the vibrant tapestry of memories now reduced to ashes, all that remained of her once full life. All that Victor deemed worthy of her was contained within two carelessly discarded suitcases huddled in the corner of the vast, echoing living room. She sank onto the lone, uncomfortable chair positioned by the panoramic window, the city lights twinkling below like a mocking constellation of happiness she could no longer reach. Each distant, shimmering point of light was a painful reminder of Victor and Elena, likely celebrating their new life, their callous disregard for the wreckage they had left in their wake. They were probably raising a toast, oblivious to the storm raging within her, their laughter echoing in some exclusive restaurant while she sat here alone, adrift in a sea of emptiness. He had not just left her. He had meticulously dismantled her, leaving her a hollow shell of her former self. And the most chilling realization of all, he had known precisely what he was doing. Days bled into weeks, each indistinguishable from the last, a monotonous cycle of despair and inertia. Catherine became a recluse within the penthouse walls, unable to summon the will to face the world, to confront the pity in the eyes of acquaintances, the veiled curiosity of strangers. Reality had become a monstrous, distorted thing, too painful to engage with. The phone, once a constant companion, a lifeline to a vibrant social circle, lay silent, a cold, accusing slab of plastic. Calls and messages flashed across the screen, desperate pleas from Olga, her closest friend attempting to breach the fortress of Catherine's despair. But Catherine remained deaf to their insistent digital cries, retreating deeper into the suffocating solitude of her grief. She existed in a liminal space, suspended between the life she had lost and a future she could not yet envision, a future shrouded in a dense fog of uncertainty and fear. The penthouse, meant to be her consolation prize, had become her prison, its panoramic views mocking her isolation, its sterile silence amplifying the deafening roar of her inner turmoil. She was adrift, unmoored, a ship lost at sea with no compass and no stars to guide her, the relentless waves of despair threatening to swallow her whole. Even the gentle snowfall, once a source of quiet beauty, now seemed to mirror the coldness that had seeped into her very bones, a relentless, silent blanket of white, mirroring the emotional wasteland within. She was lost, utterly and completely lost, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of her own shattered life. Yet even in the deepest depths of despair, the faintest spark of defiance flickered, an ember of resilience refusing to be extinguished, a silent promise whispered in the desolate chambers of her heart. This was not the end, but perhaps a terrifying, necessary, and ultimately transformative beginning. Driven by a desperate, almost primal need for human contact, Catherine ventured out. The cafe, nestled on a quiet corner a few blocks from her penthouse, seemed innocuous enough, a neutral territory to tentatively re-enter the world. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, a familiar, comforting scent that offered a momentary illusion of normalcy. She chose a secluded corner table, seeking anonymity in the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of ceramic cups. Clutching the warm mug, she inhaled deeply, the rich, dark aroma momentarily eclipsing the chill that clung to her like a second skin. For a fleeting moment, a fragile sense of peace descended, a momentary respite from the relentless storm within. But the fragile tranquility was short-lived, shattered by the careless cruelty of overheard words. At the adjacent table, two women chatted animatedly, their voices carrying with an unintended yet devastating clarity. They hadn't noticed her, tucked away in her corner, but Catherine instantly recognized one of them, an old acquaintance, the wife of a former business associate of Victor's. Her laughter, sharp and brittle, grated on Catherine's raw nerves. Laughing stock," the woman was saying, her voice laced with a venomous glee. "He left her with absolutely nothing. Poor thing. Now she's holed up in some tiny little apartment, I heard." The second woman sighed theatrically, a performance of sympathy dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "Well, she only has herself to blame, really. Too trusting. While he was already with another woman, she still thought she had a marriage." Catherine's face burned, a flush of shame and fury creeping up her neck. The coffee, once a source of comfort, turned bitter in her mouth, a vile concoction of humiliation and bile. She felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and rage. Her fingers, trembling violently, tightened their grip on the ceramic mug, threatening to shatter it. Laughing stock. Poor thing. Too trusting. It wasn't just Victor anymore. It was the world, the entire callous, gossiping, judgmental world that seemed to be mocking her, reveling in her downfall. For everyone, it seemed, she was reduced to a caricature of pity, a pathetic, weak woman who had lost everything and would never rise again. A suffocating lump formed in her throat, choking off her breath, rendering her speechless and immobile. But in that very moment, in the deepest, most excruciating depths of her humiliation, something shifted within her. The pain remained, a raw, gaping wound in her soul, but it was no longer the sole occupant of her inner landscape. It was joined by something else, something simmering, potent, and dangerous. Anger, unbidden, unexpected, and utterly transformative. Almost imperceptibly, she straightened her spine, a subtle act of defiance in the face of overwhelming despair. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the first breath that hadn't been laced with the acrid taste of grief in what felt like weeks. With a newfound quiet resolve, she rose from the table, placed a few bills on the table with a steady hand, and walked out of the cafe, without looking back. If Victor thought he had destroyed her, he was profoundly mistaken. He had merely given her a reason to become something stronger, something formidable, something he could never have anticipated. The anger, now a nascent fire in her belly, burned with a fierce, nascent intensity. But she didn't yet know what to do with this newfound, volatile fuel, how to channel this raw, untamed rage into a purpose, a direction, a path forward from the wreckage of her former life. The seed of transformation, however, had been planted, and in the darkness of her despair it had begun to sprout. In the days that followed, Catherine attempted to occupy herself with mundane tasks, a frantic, almost desperate attempt to outrun the insidious feeling of humiliation and abandonment that clung to her like a shroud. But the gnawing emptiness persisted, a hollow ache that no amount of cleaning, organizing, or mindless television could fill. Victor and Alina, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a parallel universe of opulence and oblivious happiness. Their social media feeds, carelessly public, were awash with images of extravagant vacations, lavish parties, and smug, self-satisfied smiles. Each carefully curated snapshot was a fresh stab wound to Catherine's already lacerated heart. While they basked in the glow of their newly forged selfish happiness, Catherine struggled to make ends meet, the dwindling balance in her bank account a stark, brutal reminder of her precarious new reality. The small penthouse, Victor's supposed act of generosity, came with hefty bills, mortgage payments, utilities, maintenance fees, all of which were rapidly depleting her meager resources. For the first time in years, decades even, Catherine was forced to confront the daunting, terrifying prospect of finding work. She could no longer afford the luxury of wallowing in self-pity. Survival demanded action, however daunting. With a heavy heart and a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, she donned her best, albeit now slightly dated suit, brushed her hair into a semblance of order, and ventured out on her reluctant quest for employment. Her search was a dispiriting odyssey through a landscape of polite rejection and veiled skepticism. She walked into boutiques, offices, restaurants, her carefully crafted resume clutched in her trembling hand. Each, "We're not hiring right now," or "We'll keep your application on file," a subtle, yet stinging blow to her fragile self-esteem. She was met with wary glances, perfunctory smiles that didn't reach the eyes, and carefully worded yet undeniably cold refusals. The world, it seemed, had no place for a woman suddenly stripped of her status, her wealth, her perceived usefulness. Finally, in a chic upscale coffee shop nestled in a trendy neighborhood, a flicker of possibility emerged. A "Help Wanted" sign, handwritten in elegant script, leaned against the pastry display. Waitress. The word hung in the air, a stark, unglamorous label that felt like a brand of failure seared onto her forehead. It was the only option, the last resort, a humiliating plunge from the heights of her former life to the very bottom rung of the social ladder. Summoning a forced smile, she approached the impeccably dressed manager, a woman whose cool, appraising gaze seemed to strip Catherine bare, exposing every vulnerability, every insecurity. The manager, after a cursory glance at Catherine's resume, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You have no experience working with customers," she stated flatly, her voice devoid of any warmth or encouragement, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond Catherine's shoulder. Catherine felt the familiar wave of humiliation wash over her, hot and suffocating, but she refused to avert her gaze, refused to crumble under the weight of judgment. "I have a willingness to learn," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, her chin held high. The manager paused, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, perhaps a hint of grudging respect, or maybe just a weary resignation to the realities of staffing a demanding establishment. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she nodded curtly. "Start tomorrow," she said, dismissing Catherine with a curt wave of her hand, already turning her attention back to the meticulously arranged pastries. And so it was. Catherine, who once dined in the city's finest restaurants, a patron greeted with deference and respect, found herself in the humbling, jarring position of serving coffee to people, many of whom barely acknowledged her presence, oblivious to the dramatic reversal of fortune that had landed her in this unfamiliar, unwelcome role. The descent had begun. a dizzying, vertiginous plunge into a world she had never imagined. A world of spilled lattes, demanding customers, and the constant gnawing awareness of her own fallen status. Initially, each shift was a gauntlet of subtle and not-so-subtle humiliations. The imperious snap of a wealthy patron's fingers, the curt, dismissive orders barked without a flicker of eye contact, the condescending smiles of customers who clearly recognized her, or thought they did, from her former life. Each interaction was a tiny, agonizing prick to her wounded pride. Every spilled coffee, every forgotten order, every impatient sigh felt like a cosmic indictment of her inadequacy, a public performance of her spectacular fall from grace. The tips were meager, barely enough to supplement her dwindling savings, and the physical labor, hours on her feet, balancing trays laden with steaming beverages, was a jarring contrast to the sedentary comfort of her previous existence. Yet, amidst the drudgery and the humiliation, something unexpected began to unfold within Catherine. She became an observer, a silent, almost invisible presence in the theater of the wealthy and powerful. She watched the parade of affluent patrons, impeccably dressed business executives, polished and poised women with designer handbags and surgically enhanced smiles, celebrities hiding behind oversized sunglasses and carefully constructed entourages. She listened, absorbing snippets of their conversations, fragments of deals brokered, power plays enacted, fortunes made and lost, all unfolding amidst the clatter of coffee cups and the aroma of roasted beans. She observed their behavior, the subtle nuances of their interactions, the carefully calibrated power dynamics that pulsed beneath the veneer of civility. She noticed how the truly powerful, the genuinely influential, moved through the world with an almost understated confidence, a quiet authority that required no overt displays of wealth or status. They were controlled, composed, masters of their own image and narratives, their words measured, their gestures deliberate. And then the realization dawned, sharp and clear, like a sudden burst of sunlight piercing through the gloom. Victor had always strived to appear wealthy, to project an image of power and success, but he had never truly understood what it meant to be powerful, to wield genuine influence. His wealth was a performance, a carefully constructed facade built on insecurity and a desperate need for external validation. He had confused extravagance with authority, ostentation with substance, and in the quiet anonymity of her waitress uniform, Catherine began to discern the crucial difference, to understand the subtle language of genuine power, not from textbooks or business seminars, but from the raw, unfiltered observation of those who truly possessed it. The cafe, initially a symbol of her degradation, had become an unexpected classroom, a crucible where humiliation was slowly being transmuted into a quiet, steely resolve, a nascent understanding of the game she had inadvertently stumbled into, a game far more complex and intriguing than the superficial world of charity galas and country club memberships she had once inhabited. One rainy afternoon, amidst the lunchtime rush, Catherine nearly collided with a familiar figure weaving through the crowded tables. It was Michael, an old friend from university, a fleeting acquaintance from a lifetime ago. He stopped short, his eyes widening in surprise, then shifting to a flicker of barely concealed pity as he recognized her in the waitress uniform. "Catherine, is that really you?" His voice was a mixture of genuine surprise and awkward discomfort, a hesitant bridge across the chasm of their dramatically different circumstances. Catherine managed a wan smile, devoid of genuine warmth. "Life happened, Michael." The words were clipped, intentionally vague, designed to deflect any probing questions, any unwanted expressions of sympathy. Michael, however, was not easily deterred. He was, she vaguely recalled, a successful man in the world of investments, a world she had previously viewed as abstract and distant, a realm inhabited by a different species altogether. As they talked, standing awkwardly in the bustling cafe, Michael's initial pity gave way to a growing curiosity, then to a genuine, almost unnerving, interest. He listened intently as she spoke, not about her personal woes, but about her observations of the cafe patrons, her insights into their spending habits, their investment strategies gleaned from overheard conversations, her surprisingly astute analysis of market trends she had begun to piece together from discarded newspapers and financial magazines she surreptitiously read during her breaks. He was, she realized with a jolt of surprise, genuinely impressed. Before leaving, he reached into his impeccably tailored suit jacket and extracted a business card, crisp and understated, embossed with his name and title in elegant silver lettering. He extended it to her, his gaze direct and surprisingly serious. "You have a sharp eye, Catherine, a very sharp eye. If you ever want to learn about something more substantial than serving coffee, give me a call." That night, in the sterile silence of her penthouse apartment, Catherine stared at the business card, the smooth, heavy paper feeling strangely substantial in her trembling hand. Michael's words echoed in her mind, a faint, almost unbelievable whisper of possibility in the deafening roar of her despair. Something more substantial. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. To delve into a world she knew nothing about, a world of high finance and cutthroat competition, seemed ludicrous, impossible. Yet, the alternative, a lifetime of serving coffee, of being poor Catherine, the object of pity and scorn, was even more unbearable. Victor had laughed when he left her with nothing, believing he had consigned her to a life of insignificance, a footnote in his triumphant narrative. But what if, just what if, he was wrong? What if this unexpected encounter, this hesitant offer, was not just a fluke, but a sign, an opportunity disguised as chance? What if, instead of fading into oblivion as he so confidently predicted, she could rise, not in vengeful fury, but in quiet, undeniable triumph? Sleep eluded her that night, her mind racing, possibilities colliding with doubts, fear battling with a burgeoning, almost reckless sense of hope. But beneath the turmoil, a decision began to solidify, a resolve hardening within her like steel forged in fire. Victor had underestimated her. He had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her loyalty for dependence, and he was about to discover the magnitude of his error. The next morning, Catherine took a deep breath, steadied her trembling hand, and dialed the number on the business card. Michael answered almost immediately, as if he had been anticipating her call, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I thought you'd call," he chuckled, a knowing chuckle that sent a shiver of nervous excitement down her spine. "But not this soon. I'm impressed." "I don't have time to waste," Catherine replied, her voice surprisingly firm, devoid of the tremor that had plagued her for weeks. "Not anymore." They arranged to meet. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Catherine felt a fragile tendril of hope unfurl within her, a tentative reaching towards a future she could barely imagine, a future where she was no longer defined by her past, but defined by her own burgeoning strength, resilience, and, perhaps, a touch of something akin to ambition. Michael's office was an oasis of understated elegance, a stark contrast to the sterile impersonality of her penthouse and the bustling chaos of the coffee shop. It was located in a discreet building in the financial district, far from the glitz and glamour of Victor's world, a space that spoke of quiet competence and focused power, not ostentatious displays of wealth. Michael himself was equally unassuming, dressed in a well-tailored but unflashy suit, his demeanor calm and approachable, devoid of the arrogance Catherine had come to expect from men in positions of power. "Catherine," he began, after offering her a seat in a comfortable leather armchair, his gaze direct and assessing, "you have an instinct, a keen eye for detail. But you lack the knowledge, the foundational understanding. But that," he added with a reassuring smile, handing her a thick, dauntingly titled book on investment strategies, is something we can fix. And so began Catherine's improbable apprenticeship. Her days remained a blur of coffee orders and demanding customers at the cafe, but her nights transformed into intense study sessions, poring over complex financial texts, devouring articles on market trends, and meticulously dissecting case studies of successful investments and catastrophic failures. She listened intently to the overheard conversations in the coffee shop, now not just as an observer, but as a student trying to decipher the coded language of finance, the subtle signals that hinted at fortunes being made and lost. She analyzed the behavior of the wealthy patrons, seeking to understand their risk tolerance, their investment philosophies, their decision-making processes. And then, fate, or perhaps a carefully orchestrated opportunity courtesy of Michael, intervened. He invited her to a closed-door investment evening, a gathering of seasoned professionals, high-net-worth individuals, and industry insiders. Catherine hesitated, overwhelmed by a wave of insecurity. To step into that world, so far removed from her current reality, felt like an act of audacious, almost reckless self-delusion. But Michael's gaze was firm, serious, brooking no argument. "If you want to get out of where you are, Catherine," he said, his voice low and insistent, "you need to be where decisions are made, not just serving coffee to the people making them." Summoning every last vestige of her former confidence, Catherine donned her best suit, a classic, timeless piece salvaged from her previous life, now a poignant reminder of who she once was and a symbol of who she desperately hoped to become. As she stepped into the elegant ballroom, the murmur of sophisticated conversation washing over her, she felt a wave of self-consciousness, a prickling awareness of the curious glances directed her way. But instead of shrinking, of succumbing to the familiar tide of humiliation, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked into the room, her gaze steady, her demeanor composed. She observed, she listened, she absorbed, moving through the room with a quiet grace, a silent sponge soaking up the atmosphere of power and influence. Then, during a lull in the general conversation, one of the seasoned investors, a man with a reputation for both brilliance and ruthlessness, mentioned a potential business opportunity, a high-risk, high-reward venture in an emerging market. Almost instinctively, Catherine, emboldened by her weeks of intensive study, interjected with a precise, insightful observation about the inherent volatility of that particular market, a point based on her meticulous analysis of recent economic data. The investor, initially dismissive, stopped mid-sentence, his eyebrows raised in surprise. You understand this?" he asked, his gaze now fixed on Catherine with a newfound respect. Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself for the moment, the turning point. "I'm learning," she replied, her voice clear and steady, "but I recognize opportunity when it stands in front of me." Michael, watching from across the room, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile of satisfaction. Later that evening, as they left the event, Michael clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture of genuine admiration. "You made an impression, Catherine, on exactly the right person. That's a valuable contact. Use it wisely." That night, returning to her small, impersonal apartment, Catherine felt something stir within her, something stronger than anger, more potent than the lingering ache of betrayal. It wasn't just the gnawing desire for revenge, it was something else entirely. Power. The era of humiliation was drawing to a close. The days of serving coffee were numbered. The game, she realized, had just begun. Months blurred into a whirlwind of relentless work and accelerated learning. Catherine was no longer the same woman who had trembled signing divorce papers, or the humiliated waitress pouring lukewarm coffee with a forced smile. Her knowledge of finance expanded exponentially, her instincts sharpened, Her confidence solidified with each successful investment, each calculated risk that yielded substantial rewards. She started small, cautiously navigating the treacherous waters of the market, learning from every minor victory and every inevitable setback. She devoured financial publications, attended seminars, networked relentlessly, building a formidable network of contacts, mentors, and allies. Before she even fully grasped the magnitude of her transformation, she found herself managing projects, overseeing deals, and wielding sums of money that once would have seemed impossibly, ludicrously out of reach. Michael, initially her guide and mentor, soon recognized that his protege had surpassed him, possessing a rare, almost preternatural talent for identifying opportunities, for predicting market shifts, for playing the high-stakes game of finance with an almost unnerving level of skill and intuition. Catherine no longer needed his hand-holding, his guidance. She was operating on a different plane now, a player in her own right, her trajectory soaring upwards with breathtaking speed. With each successful deal, with each burgeoning triumph, the wounds of the past, the sting of Victor's betrayal, began to fade, the scars softening, becoming less raw, less painful. But she did not forget. She could not forget. Victor, in his arrogant dismissal, had destroyed her world without a second thought, without a shred of remorse. Now it was her time. Fate, it seemed, was about to offer her a perfect, exquisitely ironic opportunity for a reckoning. One ordinary afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports in her sleek, minimalist office, the phone rang. It was Olga, her former closest friend, the one who had been burdened by guilt for not warning her sooner about Victor's infidelity. Catherine had long since ceased to harbor resentment towards Olga. Her anger was now solely directed at Victor, a focused, laser-like intensity. Catherine, Olga's voice was hesitant, laced with an almost apologetic tone. I need to tell you something." "Go ahead, Olga," Catherine replied, her voice calm, professional, devoid of any emotional inflection. "Today, I saw Victor and Elena at that new Italian place downtown, and you won't believe what I overheard." A pregnant pause hung in the air, thick with anticipation. He still thinks you're living in poverty," Olga blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush. Catherine remained silent, not out of surprise, but because Olga's revelation merely confirmed what she already instinctively knew. Victor, consumed by his own ego, his own self-importance, hadn't even bothered to inquire about her fate. He had simply erased her from his narrative, relegated her to the dusty annals of his past, confident that she had vanished, inconsequential, from the vibrant tapestry of his life. A quiet, almost mirthless chuckle escaped Catherine's lips. Perfect. That evening, Catherine slid into the plush leather seats of her brand-new custom-designed sedan, the soft scent of Italian leather filling her senses, a far cry from the sterile, impersonal air of her penthouse apartment. As she drove, navigating the city streets with a newfound sense of effortless command, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, a fleeting acknowledgement of how far she had come, from the brink of despair to the cusp of something extraordinary. Suddenly, at a busy intersection, her eyes caught sight of something that made her instinctively slow down. Standing on the sidewalk, bathed in the harsh glare of streetlights, was Elena, arguing heatedly on her phone, her expensive designer handbag clutched tightly in her hand, a luxury car parked carelessly at the curb behind her. Catherine smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. Fate, it seemed, was indeed playing on her side. Returning to her opulent penthouse apartment, she poured herself a glass of chilled white wine, the crystal glass gleaming in the soft light, and settled into a comfortable armchair overlooking the glittering cityscape. Victor had laughed when he shattered her life, confident in his victory, blinded by his arrogance. But what, she wondered, would he do when he finally realized the magnitude of his colossal mistake? She didn't need to seek him out. The truth, she knew, would inevitably, inexorably find him, and Catherine, with a quiet sense of anticipation simmering beneath her composed exterior, was ready to savor the moment. The inevitable moment of his dawning, devastating realization. The night was deceptively calm, the city lights twinkling with their usual indifferent brilliance, but inside Victor's sprawling, expensively decorated apartment, a subtle unease had begun to fester. He found Elena already waiting for him, perched gracefully on the plush velvet sofa, a crystal glass of wine swirling delicately in her manicured hand. He immediately noticed something different in her demeanor, a subtle shift in her gaze, a flicker of something akin to anxiety, something she was attempting, rather clumsily, to conceal. "What's wrong?" he asked, tossing his keys carelessly onto the marble-topped console table, his voice sharper than he intended. Elena hesitated, her fingers tracing slow circles around the rim of her wineglass, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid before finally lifting her eyes to meet his. "I saw your ex-wife today," she stated, the words hanging in the air like a discordant note. Victor raised an eyebrow, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "And? I'm sure it wasn't in the most glamorous of locations." Elena's gaze didn't waver, her expression remaining disconcertingly serious. "I saw Catherine driving a very expensive car." His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a dismissive wave of his hand. "You must be mistaken. I left Catherine with nothing. A tiny apartment and just enough money to survive. She has no wealthy family, no influential connections. It's impossible." Elena placed her wineglass on the side table, the crystal clinking softly against the polished wood. She leaned forward, her voice low and insistent. "I'm not mistaken, Victor. It was a luxury car. The kind of car you couldn't afford right now even if you wanted to." The words, seemingly innocuous, struck him with the force of an invisible blow. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't quite define. A mixture of disbelief, annoyance, and a nascent, unwelcome flicker of fear. "Luxury car?" he repeated, the words sounding hollow, almost absurd, even to his own ears. He instinctively reached for his phone, scrolling through old photos of Catherine, images of a woman he now barely recognized, a woman he had deemed weak, dependent, utterly incapable of navigating the world without his guidance. Something in his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble, a hairline fracture appearing in the edifice of his self-assuredness. He refused to believe it, vehemently, internally, yet the seed of doubt, once planted, began to take root, insidious and persistent. In the days that followed, Victor found himself increasingly consumed by the unsettling image of Catherine driving a luxury car. He couldn't shake it, couldn't dismiss it as a figment of Elena's imagination or a fleeting anomaly. Elena, sensing his growing unease, did little to reassure him, maintaining a studied silence, her expressions veiled, her demeanor subtly, almost imperceptibly changed. She no longer showered him with the effusive adoration that had initially fueled his ego. A cool detachment had crept into their interactions, a subtle shift in the power dynamic he had been so confident in controlling. He began to obsessively search for Catherine online, a fruitless endeavor. She had vanished from social media, erased her digital footprint seemingly deliberately, as if she had retreated into an alternate dimension, leaving no trace for him to track. He tried discreetly asking mutual acquaintances, casually mentioning her name in conversation, but the responses were uniformly vague, evasive, or dismissive. It was as if she had ceased to exist in their shared social circles, a ghost from a past they had all collectively agreed to forget. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, as Victor exited a high-rise business center after a particularly grueling and unproductive meeting, he saw her, standing near the curb, bathed in the crisp morning sunlight, undeniably, unmistakably, Catherine. But it wasn't the Catherine he remembered, the Catherine he had discarded. This woman exuded an aura of quiet power, an almost palpable confidence that radiated from her very posture. Her tailored suit, impeccably cut and undeniably expensive, fit her perfectly, emphasizing a newfound sleekness, a sculpted elegance he had never noticed before. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and was speaking animatedly into her phone, her gestures assured, her voice commanding, while a uniformed chauffeur held open the door of a gleaming black car, waiting patiently for her. Victor froze, rooted to the spot, observing her from across the street, a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. She moved with a fluid grace he had never associated with the woman he had known. Her composure was absolute, her expression serene, almost indifferent to the world around her, as if she occupied a different sphere of existence altogether. As she calmly slid into the back seat of the car, without so much as a glance in his direction, a chilling realization pierced through Victor's carefully constructed defenses. What the hell? The unspoken question echoed in his mind, a chaotic jumble of confusion, denial, and a dawning, terrifying sense of disorientation. Her silhouette, framed by the tinted windows of the luxury car, her unwavering posture, her utter indifference to his presence. It was all profoundly unsettling, inexplicably, disturbingly wrong. She looked like she had been born into this world of effortless wealth and understated power, like she had always belonged to this rarefied atmosphere. But how? How could the woman he had left with nothing, the woman he had deemed incapable and dependent, now appear more successful, more powerful, more complete than he was himself? The question gnawed at him, a persistent, unwelcome intruder in his meticulously curated world of self-deception. The seed of doubt had sprouted, grown, and now threatened to bloom into a full-blown, terrifying realization. He had to know the truth. He had to understand how this impossible transformation had occurred. Driven by a frantic need for answers, Victor began his own clandestine investigation. He made discreet calls to former business associates, casually probing for information about Catherine, cloaking his inquiries in feigned concern, weaving elaborate tales of running into her and wondering how she was doing. He expected to uncover some scandal, some hidden benefactor, some illicit shortcut that could explain her sudden, inexplicable rise. But the truth, when it began to surface, was far more mundane and infinitely more devastating than any lurid speculation he could have concocted. Catherine, he discovered, hadn't stumbled upon a secret inheritance, nor had she ensnared a wealthy new patron. Her ascent was the result of sheer unadulterated hard work, relentless dedication, and a previously untapped and utterly formidable business acumen. She had, through sheer will and intellect, transformed herself into a force to be reckoned with in the very world he believed he controlled. She had made strategic investments, built a diverse portfolio, and cultivated a reputation for shrewdness and unwavering resolve. And, most terrifyingly of all, her influence was expanding, reaching into sectors that directly intersected with, and potentially overshadowed, his own business empire. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow, a gut-wrenching realization that sent the blood draining from his face. Unbeknownst to him, unknowingly, Victor's own carefully constructed empire was now, in some insidious, unavoidable way, dependent on Catherine's burgeoning power. One day, at a crucial board meeting, a meeting he had anticipated with confidence, expecting routine approvals and easy victories, he sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere the moment he walked into the room. The usual air of jovial camaraderie was replaced by a tense, almost conspiratorial, silence. Whispered conversations ceased abruptly as he entered, and he was met with a strange mixture of averted gazes and thinly veiled apprehension. "Victor!" one of the senior board members began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. We need to discuss some adjustments to our partnership agreements." "Adjustments?" Victor frowned, a prickle of unease creeping up his spine. "What kind of adjustments?" "A new investor has come on board," the board member explained, his voice strained, his gaze flickering nervously around the room. "And we need to align our interests with their interests." "Investor?" Victor repeated, his voice tight, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. "What investor?" The board member took a deep breath, avoiding eye contact, and uttered a single name, a name that shattered Victor's carefully constructed world into a million irreparable fragments. "Catherine." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Victor's feet. Silence descended upon the room, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the frantic hammering of his own heart against his ribs. He attempted to maintain a semblance of composure, to project an image of unwavering control, but beneath the carefully constructed facade, a cold, paralyzing terror began to spread through his veins. Catherine, not just recovered, not just surviving, but thriving, powerful, influential, and now, undeniably, inextricably intertwined with his own fate. He stumbled out of the meeting room, the hushed whispers of his colleagues echoing in his ears, the world around him blurring at the edges. For the first time in his life, Victor experienced a feeling he had never encountered before, a feeling that gnawed at his gut, stole his breath, and filled him with a chilling premonition of impending disaster, fear. Elena noticed his disquiet the moment he walked back into the apartment that evening. "You seem different," she observed, her voice cool, her gaze appraising, no longer laced with the syrupy sweetness she had once deployed so liberally. Victor sank heavily onto the plush sofa, running a trembling hand through his already disheveled hair. She controls everything now," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Elena's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched upwards, a hint of sardonic amusement flickering in her eyes. "Catherine?" she asked, crossing her arms across her chest, her posture radiating an unsettling blend of curiosity and something else, something akin to contempt. "Interesting," she mused, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "And you thought she would weep for you forever?" The venom in Elena's words was unmistakable, a cold, acidic spray that stung Victor to the core. He felt it, sharp and piercing, and in that instant, a devastating truth crystallized within him. Elena no longer looked at him with the same admiring, worshipful gaze. The sparkle of adoration in her eyes had vanished, replaced by something colder, harder, infinitely more calculating. And then, the full, terrifying weight of his predicament crashed down upon him. He had lost control. Utterly, irrevocably lost control. Catherine was no longer a footnote in his life, a dismissed inconvenience. She was now the architect of his potential downfall, the puppeteer pulling the strings of his carefully constructed world. The humiliation, the devastating, soul-crushing humiliation, was his now. Victor's meticulously constructed world began to unravel with terrifying speed. The subtle shift in the board meeting was merely the first tremor of an earthquake that threatened to swallow his entire empire. Investors, once eager to align themselves with his ventures, began to withdraw, citing vague, shifting market conditions or reassessing risk profiles. Key clients, long-standing partnerships he had taken for granted, became inexplicably unreachable, their calls unanswered, their emails ignored. Deals that had seemed certain, contracts he had considered signed and sealed, began to crumble, inexplicably falling apart at the last minute. A chilling, almost supernatural pattern emerged. Every avenue he pursued, every attempt to salvage his faltering business, seemed to be inexplicably, systematically blocked. He was being subtly, expertly suffocated. And, underlying it all, the terrifying unspoken certainty. Catherine. Elena, once his constant adoring companion, now observed his unraveling with a detached, almost clinical interest. Her once effusive affections dwindled to curt acknowledgments. Her once eager presence receded into a cool, increasingly infrequent detachment. Her gestures became clipped, her words terse, her silences heavy with unspoken judgment. One night, as Victor frantically attempted to salvage a crucial, potentially company-saving contract, he heard the distinct sound of suitcase wheels rolling across the polished hardwood floor of their bedroom. He turned to see Elena standing in the doorway, a designer suitcase at her feet, a luxurious fur coat draped casually over her arm, her expression utterly devoid of emotion. "What are you doing?" His voice was weaker than he intended, laced with a desperate plea he couldn't quite conceal. She sighed, a sound heavy with weary exasperation, and slowly smoothed a stray strand of her perfectly blonde hair, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond his shoulder. "I'm leaving, Victor." A dead silence descended upon the room, thick and suffocating. Victor blinked several times, his mind struggling to process the simple, devastating words. Leaving. Now. Elena crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly, her gaze now meeting his, cold and appraising, utterly devoid of warmth. "I was with you because you were strong, a winner. But look at you now." She gestured dismissively around the opulent apartment, her hand encompassing the entirety of his crumbling empire. "You're losing everything. You really think I'm going to drown with you?" Anger flared, a desperate, impotent rage bubbling up inside him. "You're abandoning me. After everything." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched her lips, a cruel, dismissive curve that spoke volumes. "Yes," she stated simply, her voice devoid of any remorse or regret. "Just like you abandoned Catherine, when you decided she was no longer useful to you." Her words were like shards of ice, piercing him with chilling precision, each syllable a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty. Before Victor could formulate a response, a retort, a plea, Elena turned and walked out, disappearing through the doorway without a backward glance, leaving behind her only the deafening silence of her absence. For the first time, Victor was truly, utterly alone. He sank onto the plush sofa, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Elena had stood, his mind reeling, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. His business was collapsing, his connections dissolving. The woman for whom he had discarded Catherine had abandoned him with casual indifference. But the most brutal, agonizing realization of all was this. Catherine hadn't done any of this to him. She hadn't plotted revenge, hadn't orchestrated his downfall. She had simply risen, while he had crumbled. Time moved forward, relentlessly, indifferently. But for Victor, everything that had seemed solid, immutable, was now reduced to ruins. He had lost his company, his social standing, the respect of those who had once fawned over him. And most devastatingly of all, he had lost the one thing that had fueled his carefully constructed illusion of invincibility, his own inflated ego. He now lived in a smaller, rented apartment, a cramped, impersonal space a fraction of the size of his former penthouse, stripped of the opulent luxuries he had come to consider his birthright. The phone, once a constant, insistent symphony of ringing invitations and lucrative offers, remained stubbornly, accusingly, silent. The world continued to spin, indifferent to his demise, while Victor remained trapped, mired in the wreckage of his own self-inflicted destruction. One bleak afternoon, wandering aimlessly through the city streets, his pockets empty, his spirit hollowed out, Victor found himself walking past an exclusive, high-end restaurant. The kind of establishment he once frequented without a second thought, a casual indulgence in his former life of extravagance. But it wasn't the familiar opulence of the restaurant that made him stop short, his heart clenching in a vice of pain. It was the scene unfolding within, visible through the expansive, crystal-clear windows. There, seated at an elegantly draped table, bathed in the soft, flattering glow of candlelight, was Catherine. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling with genuine amusement, surrounded by a group of well-dressed, influential-looking people clearly at ease, undeniably, irrevocably belonging to that world. Every gesture, every nuance of her demeanor exuded confidence, power, and a quiet, self-assured grace. There was no trace, no vestige of the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had discarded. She had been reborn, transformed, utterly and completely remade in her own image. And then, in a moment that seemed to suspend time, their eyes met. Across the crowded, opulent restaurant, across the chasm of their radically divergent lives, their gazes locked. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the world around Victor dissolved, faded into insignificance. Catherine didn't flinch, didn't avert her gaze, didn't betray a flicker of recognition, pity, or even animosity. She simply looked at him directly, unflinchingly, with an expression that was more devastating than any outburst of anger, any act of revenge, could ever have been. Indifference. Utter, complete, and utterly chilling indifference. He didn't matter. He was insignificant. He was, to her, nothing. Without knowing what else to do, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming wave of shame and regret, Victor averted his gaze and walked on, his chest constricted, his throat tight, his mouth dry, the taste of bitter defeat coating his tongue. For the first time, truly and unequivocally, he grasped the full, devastating weight of his actions. He hadn't just lost Catherine. He had lost the chance to be part of something extraordinary, the chance to share his life with a truly remarkable woman. And that, he realized with the sickening lurch of his heart, was his greatest, most irreversible, and most deserved defeat.